As a speaker, one of your greatest tools is language. Language is simply a collection of symbols that we use to communicate with one another. Symbols are ideas or thoughts or sounds or letters that represent something else. And when you have a collection of symbols that everybody in society agrees upon, that's what a language is. So the difference between English and Spanish is simply we have chosen different symbols to represent these ideas, beliefs, and attitudes. So understanding language and how to use language is very important for you to become an effective speaker. The model of communication helps us to understand how symbols and language generally help us to spread ideas and to connect with our audience. Again, think about communication as the process of taking a thought from my mind, transferring it into a symbol, sending it to you, and either you see the symbol or you hear the symbol, and you transfer that symbol into a thought. And good communicators are better at getting those thoughts to be similar. So either I'm trying to take a thought from my mind and transfer it to your mind, or together we're working to create some sort of mutual beneficial thought. And that's the goal of speakers. However, there are things that make this difficult. For example, we have what we call noise. Anytime you're trying to communicate, noise is present. Noise might mean physical noise, like a train driving by that makes it hard to hear. But noise might be other things going on in that situation that are distracting from the message. For example, have you ever tried to listen to someone when you're super hungry? It's hard, right? Because your body is distracted by other things. That's noise. So anything that might distract or dilute the symbol that I'm trying to send to you is an example of noise. Now, we've already talked in class a little bit about these fields of experiences and how this process works. One thing I want to just point out to make sure that you know is encoding and decoding. So as I take my thoughts and I transfer them into symbol, I am encoding my message. You currently are hearing my words and watching this video, and you are decoding, which is you're transferring these symbols into thoughts. The skill that is important for communicators is to choose symbols that accurately transfer. So if I ask you to think about a tree, that's a really broad symbol, and you might not picture the exact same tree that I'm thinking. But if I were to describe a Christmas tree and maybe give you some details about the colors and the lights and the height of the tree, I might use more effective tools to help you picture the exact Christmas tree that I'm thinking of. Let's then talk about some of the characteristics of language so that we can understand how these symbols work and we can better know how to manipulate them or use them to improve our communication. So we're going to cover 5 characteristics of language to help you understand how this works a little bit better. The first characteristic is that language is powerful. Language gives us power. The first way that language gives us power is by being conventional. Language helps us to connect with other people. It helps us to have conversations that we couldn't otherwise have. Think back to years and years ago with cavemen when they're just grunting and they can't really communicate with one another. They can't share knowledge with one another. So language is also powerful because it is the basis for social knowledge. It allows us to collect knowledge together. If you go to a library and you see all those books on the walls, that is language that allows us to gather our thoughts together and build off of one another. So that way, when you were born, you didn't have to learn how to make an engine from scratch. Somebody's already taught you, already figured out how to make an engine, and all you have to do is read that, and then you can advance it further. So language allows us to have a basis for social knowledge that we can build together and we can connect with other people. The third way that language is powerful is it defines our physical reality, meaning it allows us to tell what the physical reality is and therefore how we will use the physical reality. Think about the chair that you are sitting on right now. If we were to call that chair a throne, there's a certain connotation connected with that. You might feel very powerful as you're sitting there in your throne. If we call the same chair time out, you're going to feel different sitting in that same chair. Now, the properties of the chair haven't changed at all. Your language can't do that. We're not magicians. But your language can change our emotion connected with an object. It can change how we act around that object, right? So if I have a desk, I could change that desk and call it a dining room table, and we might use it very differently, even though the physical properties have not changed at all. So language is powerful because it allows us to define our physical reality. Language also allows us to create social reality. There are things that would not exist socially if we didn't have language. Think about the concept of love. If you couldn't communicate with another person, could you have love? Not really. Your mind wouldn't be able to grasp that concept. So love or freedom or hope or these social realities come because we have language to describe them. Here's another example. Think back to your first time that you had a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Did something change in the relationship once you started calling them your boyfriend or girlfriend? I imagine it did. Even though nothing else might have changed about the relationship, all of a sudden when you're comfortable to start calling them boyfriend or girlfriend out in public, something changes about that relationship. Maybe you feel more committed, you're more presented to other people, and so it feels more official. So using language allows us to create certain social realities. If I call someone my best friend versus if I call them my enemy, I'm likely to have different emotions that arise when I see them. And the last way that language is powerful is that it allows us to accomplish our goals. For example, have you ever asked someone to pass the salt? When they reach over the table and they grab the salt and hand it down to you, that's really something you have accomplished through your language. They did the physical work of passing the salt, but you were able to accomplish your goal by using language. In the same way, every time you turn in an assignment, every time you do something for your boss, you're accomplishing goals through language. So that is 5 ways that language is powerful. But that's just the first characteristic of language. So let's go back and talk about the second characteristic of language. Language is arbitrary. And what that means is that the symbol and the referent are not necessarily connected to one another, meaning the symbol does not matter. Remember, symbols are simply something that represents something else. The symbol representing a specific object does not really matter. For example, right here, we have what we would call a pen, right? So the sound coming out of my mouth, pen, that's a symbol for this thing. But the symbol, when I say pen, that sound is not a pen itself. It's a representation of the pen, and it's arbitrary. So it doesn't really matter what we want it, what symbol we use. If we wanted to call this a cow, and everybody in society agreed that this was a cow, then that's okay, as long as we agree upon it. So language is arbitrary, meaning the symbol, the sound, or the letters I write are not the thing itself. Language is also abstract. Abstract meaning that it can be either concrete, meaning very specific, or it can be fluid or very general. An example of this might be, I might talk about having assets on my farm. An asset on a farm is a very fluid or general term. It can mean a lot of different things. It might mean something like a tractor is an asset on a farm, a cattle are assets, the land itself are assets on the farm, sheep might be assets, maybe those working for me might be assets on my farm. So it's a really broad term. But I might be more specific. I might start to talk, okay, I'm going to talk about just the cattle on my farm. And that's more specific, but it's still fairly broad. So I can get a little bit more specific, and I'm only going to talk about the dairy cows on my farm. And that's still broad because I might have thousands and thousands of dairy cows. So let's get more specific. Let's talk about one cow named Bessie. Now that's a very concrete symbol. It means just one cow. There's only one cow that can be that Bessie. So language can be either abstract, meaning it's really broad and can have lots of different categories that fit under it, or it can be very concrete. Language is also ambiguous, meaning that some symbols can have multiple meanings. So one symbol might mean something different for you than it means for me. So it could be very ambiguous. This is used a lot in political speeches. Have you ever seen a politician get up and talk about freedom? And then and you're thinking to yourself, oh, I like freedom. But then as they're describing their view of freedom, it's very different than your view of freedom. That's because freedom is a very ambiguous term. It means something different for each person. So language, and there's lots of different ambiguous terms like what does love mean? What does hope mean? But even smaller things, smaller words might have different meanings. Even things like there, and there. The symbol themselves, the sound, although writing it you can see the differences, the sound is hard to understand the differences, and so people find that ambiguous. And finally, so the fifth characteristic of language is that language is dynamic. Dynamic simply means change. Language changes over time. And you probably have already seen this in your life. You've seen this where new words come up that mean something that they would not have meant years ago, right? In terms or slang changes, even how we use formal words. Right now we use the word broadcast to mean to broadcast a show, right? We're broadcasting out radio waves so that people can see our show. 100 years ago, when they didn't have technology, the word broadcast was a form of planting, a way of reaching into your sack, grabbing a handful of seeds, and just broadcasting or throwing them out. So language itself changes over time. So the meaning of symbols change over time. To help view this a little bit differently, we have what we call the semantic triangle of meaning. This helps us to see how symbols create meaning. So for each physical object, which you can see there at the bottom left there, we have a physical object here being a cat, the actual thing. All of those are represented by a symbol. That symbol is over on the bottom right-hand side. So we have the symbol CAT. That's a symbol for the word cat, or for the object cat. In different languages, it's something different, like gato in Spanish. And remember that those are arbitrary. It doesn't really matter what we call it. Now, the other interesting part of this is because language is ambiguous and we have different feelings about this, these create different concepts. So at the top of the triangle, what you're seeing is in our minds, those have different concepts. And cat is a great example of this. If I start talking about cats, all of you are able to connect that symbol with the object of a physical animal cat, but many of you are going to have different emotions on cats. Some of you are going to think, oh, cute, and others are going to think, that's gross, get it away from me. So we have different concepts or different feelings or emotions surrounding these concepts or these symbols. Now, I did want to point out that there are some limits to language. Language is powerful. It can help us accomplish our goals, and it can help us become effective speakers. However, there are limits. Here's an example. How many legs does a dog have if you call the tail a leg? You might think, okay, dogs typically have 4 legs. If we call the tail a leg, that makes it so there are 5 legs, because language allows us to do that, right? However, the law of identity suggests that something is itself and cannot be its opposite. So just because you call the tail a leg does not make it a leg, right? So you cannot change what something is physically. Language is important, so we use it to define our physical reality and to create our social reality. But it's also important to use precise language because we need to communicate effectively and know that language cannot change the thing itself. So just because someone goes around saying that a dog has 5 legs doesn't mean that the dog actually has 5 legs. So changing what we call something may change how we interact with it, but it does not necessarily change the thing itself.